Thank you for joining me on The Things That Bother Me. This channel isn't about nostalgia. It's not about pretending every generation experienced the same America. And it's not about ignoring the structural changes that shaped the country over the last 50 years. It's about looking at those changes honestly. Because once something becomes normal, people stop questioning how it happened. This series has been about one simple question. How did the most prosperous economic system in modern American history slowly become a system where younger generations struggle just to reach the starting line? We looked at the opportunity gap. We looked at how access tightened. We looked at corporate consolidation. We looked at retirement security stacking upward. And we looked at the demographic math now straining the entire structure. Today we reach the final piece of that story. Episode 7, The Cost of Excess. Who pays the price? Because when a system shifts too far in one direction for too long, the consequences eventually show up somewhere. Not always immediately. Not always for the same people who benefited the most. But eventually the imbalance has to resolve itself. And that resolution is what this episode is about. Let's get into it. Episode 7, The Cost of Excess. Who pays the price? For decades the system looked like it was working. Markets climbed. Home values soared. Retirement portfolios expanded. Corporate profits shattered records. Politicians promised prosperity. And millions of people believed the story. That the economy was stronger than ever. But economic systems are like ecosystems. They only survive when resources circulate. When opportunity flows forward. When new generations can enter the system and build their own stability. But when too much value flows in one direction for too long, something changes. The system doesn't collapse overnight. It tightens. Pressure builds slowly. Costs shift. Promises weaken. And eventually the bill arrives. Not always for the people who benefited the most, but for the people who came after. Because excess always has a cost. And someone always pays it. This episode is about that cost. And the uncomfortable question behind it. If one generation extracted more than the system could sustain, who pays the price? Section 1, The bill always arrives. Economic systems can hide imbalance for years. Sometimes decades. Debt fills the gaps. Asset bubbles create the illusion of prosperity. Government borrowing postpones difficult choices. But eventually the system has to reconcile the numbers. Promises made. Resources available. Workers paying in. Retirees drawing out. And when those numbers drift too far apart, something must adjust. The bill always arrives. The only question is, who receives it? Section 2, The housing cost. Housing is one of the clearest examples of generational imbalance. Boomers bought homes when prices were far lower relative to income. Over decades, those homes appreciated dramatically. For many retirees, home equity became their largest financial asset. But those rising prices created a barrier for younger generations. Today's buyers face down payments that take years to save. Mortgage payments consuming large portions of income. Competition from investors. And zoning policies that restrict supply. The asset that created security for one generation became the wall blocking the next. And the price is paid by those still trying to enter the market. Section 3, The debt generation. When wages stagnate and costs rise, people borrow. Student loans replaced affordable education. Credit cards filled gaps in daily living. Auto loans expanded. Mortgages stretched longer. Debt allowed younger generations to survive inside an increasingly expensive system. But debt is not wealth. It is borrowed stability. And borrowed stability eventually becomes repayment. Section 4, The retirement burden. Retirement systems were designed for a different demographic reality. More workers. Fewer retirees. Shorter life expectancy. But today the population is aging. Millions of boomers are retiring. and they are living longer than any generation before them. That means more benefit payments, more healthcare spending, more strain on Social Security and Medicare. Younger workers are now supporting the largest retirement population in American history, while facing a far more uncertain retirement themselves. Section 5, the tax question. Eventually, every promise meets the same reality. Funding. Who pays for the benefits? Workers. Taxpayers. Future borrowing. The cost of retirement systems does not disappear. It moves. And as the retiree population grows, those costs increasingly shift to younger generations. Not because anyone wants to punish them, because the math leaves no other place for the bill to go. Section 6, the healthcare explosion. Healthcare costs continue rising faster than inflation. Older populations require more care, more medication, more procedures, more long-term support. Programs like Medicare and Medicaid absorb much of that cost. But those programs are funded by taxes and federal spending, which means younger workers are not only funding retirement benefits, they are funding the most expensive healthcare system in the world. And the costs keep rising. Section 7, the children who never arrive. Economic pressure has consequences beyond finances. Younger generations are delaying or abandoning family formation. Birth rates have fallen dramatically. People cannot afford homes. Childcare costs explode. Healthcare costs expand. Economic instability discourages long-term planning. So fewer families form, and fewer children are born, which creates an even smaller workforce in the future, and an even heavier burden on the system. Section 8, the political protection. One reason the imbalance persisted so long is political reality. Boomers vote in large numbers. Retirement benefits are politically untouchable. Social Security reform is delayed. Medicare costs are avoided. Housing reform is resisted by homeowners protecting property values. Politicians rarely challenge the groups most likely to vote against them. So difficult reforms are postponed, and the burden quietly shifts forward in time to the next generation. Section 9, the growing resentment. Generational resentment is not inevitable, but economic imbalance can create it. Younger workers see rising costs. They see shrinking opportunity. They see retirement benefits they may never receive. And they see older generations defending a system that worked for them. The result is frustration. Not because younger generations hate retirees, because they feel locked out of the same stability. Section 10, the system eventually adjusts. Economic systems cannot sustain imbalance forever. Eventually something changes. Benefits shrink. Taxes rise. Retirement ages increase. Or the entire system restructures. History shows this again and again. When systems become unsustainable, reform eventually arrives. Sometimes gradually. Sometimes suddenly. But it arrives. Because math always resolves imbalance. Section 11, the self-interest problem. There's something else that has to be said. The problem isn't just policy. The problem is attitude. For decades, the dominant political instinct of the baby boomer generation has been simple. Protect what benefits us. Cut what benefits someone else. When they were young, they supported expanding programs, affordable education, government investment, public infrastructure, social programs. But as they aged, something changed. Once they owned homes, once their retirement accounts grew, once their Social Security benefits approached, once their property values rose, the political priorities shifted. Programs that helped the poor became waste. Programs that helped younger families became handouts. Programs that expanded opportunity became too expensive. But retirement programs? Untouchable. Home value protections? Sacred. Tax advantages for retirement savings? Essential. The same generation that benefited from government investment for decades suddenly discovered fiscal discipline, but only when someone else needed help. That isn't just policy preference. That's self-interest. Section 12, the cluelessness problem. There's another pattern that appears again and again. Refusal to acknowledge how the world has changed. Boomers often compare their early lives to young people today and say, "We struggled too." But the numbers tell a different story. College tuition was a fraction of today's cost. Homes were far cheaper relative to income. Healthcare was dramatically less expensive. Stable careers were more accessible. You could work a modest job and still buy a house. You could attend college without lifelong debt. You could support a family on a single income. That world no longer exists. But many boomers refuse to acknowledge the change. Instead, they repeat the same phrases. Work harder. Stop complaining. We did it. Those phrases only make sense if the system hasn't changed. But the system has changed. Radically. And refusing to acknowledge that change is not wisdom. It's denial. Section 13, protecting their own comfort. The final piece of the puzzle is political behavior. Boomers have been one of the most reliable voting blocs in modern history. And they vote consistently to protect their interests. They defend property values through zoning restrictions. They defend retirement benefits through political pressure. They resist tax increases that would expand opportunity for younger generations. They support cutting programs that help the poor. Food assistance, housing assistance, education support, healthcare expansion. Programs designed to help the most vulnerable become targets for cuts. Why? Because cutting those programs protects taxes and benefits that maintain middle-class comfort. It protects the lifestyle they built. And that's the uncomfortable truth. The generation that once marched for social change now votes to protect its own stability, even when that stability comes at the expense of those below them. Section 14, consequences before the end. There is one more uncomfortable possibility that rarely gets discussed. The generation that benefited the most from the system may not escape its consequences entirely. For decades, the political focus was protecting what already existed. Protecting property values. Protecting retirement benefits. Protecting investment growth. Cutting social programs that helped the poor. Reducing safety nets that supported struggling families. Limiting public investment that helped younger generations get started. All of those decisions preserved comfort for the present. But they also weakened the systems underneath it. And those weakened systems do not wait patiently for generational transitions. They begin to crack while the same generation is still here. Medicaid cuts. Long-term care shortages. Social Security trust fund strain. Healthcare systems under pressure. Housing instability spreading across the economy. Programs that once helped the vulnerable disappear. And here is the irony. Many of the same programs that were cut or weakened over decades are the very programs older Americans may eventually need the most. Medicaid funds a huge portion of nursing home care in the United States. When families cannot afford long-term care, Medicaid often becomes the only safety net left. But when safety nets are weakened for decades in the name of fiscal discipline, they are weaker when the need finally arrives. Self-interest can create a dangerous illusion. The illusion that the system will always protect you. But systems are ecosystems. If you weaken the support structures long enough, eventually the structure weakens for everyone. Even the people who believed they were insulated. The self-centered generation spent decades protecting their comfort. But the consequences of that protection may arrive before the generation itself is gone. Not as punishment, as cause and effect. Because systems weakened at the bottom and hurt other generations for 40 years do not remain strong forever. And when they finally begin to fail, they fail for everyone, even boomers. Section 15, when the bill hits the states. There is another place where the cost of this generational imbalance shows up. State budgets. For decades, many states promised extremely generous pensions to public workers, teachers, police officers, government employees. At the time those promises were made, the math looked manageable. The workforce was large. Retirements were shorter. Healthcare costs were lower. But today those pension systems are carrying enormous obligations. Billions of dollars in liabilities. Some states now spend more on pension payments than on infrastructure, higher education, or social programs. Every year the check has to go out. And when the pension payment comes due, something else gets cut. Schools, public services, programs helping low-income families. The bill doesn't disappear. It burdens everyone else, often to younger taxpayers who are funding benefits they themselves will never receive, making a fraction of the money that boomers received. Section 16, the multi-income retirement. For many boomers, retirement income does not come from just one place. It comes from several. Social Security, pensions, 401k portfolios, stock dividends, home equity. Each one of those income streams alone might be manageable for the system. But when millions of retirees receive several at once, the financial pressure multiplies. Workers fund Social Security. Taxpayers fund pension systems. Corporate profits fund portfolios. Housing markets fund equity. Each layer pulls resources from somewhere. And when those layers stack up for the same generation, the burden underneath grows unbearable. The issue isn't that retirees receive benefits. The issue is balance. Something boomers seem to know nothing about. When benefits grow faster than the economy supporting them, government strain, younger workers carry heavier taxes, and future promises become impossible to keep. That's when the question stops being political and becomes mathematical. The system has to adjust, because eventually the numbers demand it. In closing, Episode 7. The cost of excess. Who pays the price? Step back and look at the entire pattern. One generation entered adulthood during one of the most economically generous periods in American history. Housing was affordable. College was inexpensive. Wages were rising alongside productivity. Union power gave workers leverage. Government invested heavily in infrastructure, education, and public systems. The latter was real, and millions of boomers climbed it. But what happened next is the story of this series. Once that generation secured its place inside the system, the priorities shifted. The ladder didn't stay open. Housing supply tightened through zoning restrictions. College became expensive and debt-driven. Pensions disappeared for new workers. Corporate power consolidated. Wages stagnated while asset prices exploded. And the generation already inside the system focused on protecting what they had gained. Property values. Investment growth. Retirement benefits. Stability for themselves. Programs that helped the poor were cut. Public investment that helped younger families declined. But the programs protecting retirement and property remained politically untouchable. That wasn't an accident. That was self-interest. And self-interest became the defining political instinct of the baby boomer generation. At the same time, something else happened. Many boomers refused to acknowledge how much the world had changed. They compared their early lives to young people today and insisted the opportunities were the same. They repeated the same old outdated crap. Work harder. Stop complaining. We had it tough too. But the structure had changed. Housing prices exploded. Student debt replaced affordable education. Healthcare costs surged. Stable careers disappeared. The ladder that once lifted a generation into the middle class had been lifted away. And while younger generations struggled to secure even basic stability, many boomers retired with stacked security. Social Security. Pensions. 401k portfolios. Stock market gains. Home equity that multiplied over decades. Multiple layers of protection. Meanwhile, the generations below them inherited something very different: debt, housing barriers, volatile employment, retirement uncertainty, and the responsibility to fund the largest retiree population in American history. The cost of that imbalance shows up everywhere: in state budgets strained by pension obligations, in social security systems facing demographic pressure, in younger workers paying more taxes for benefits they may never receive, in housing markets that lock new buyers out, in birth rates falling because younger families cannot afford the future. For decades, the system kept functioning. Checks were written, benefits were paid, markets rose. But underneath the surface, the pressure kept building. Because economic systems require renewal. They require new generations entering the system with the ability to build stability of their own. When that entry disappears, the foundation weakens. And eventually the math demands adjustment. Some of the consequences may arrive before the generation that benefited most is gone. Programs weakened over decades may be needed by the same retirees who once supported cutting them. Healthcare systems strained by rising costs may struggle to provide the care aging populations need. The safety nets reduced for others may be weaker when they are finally needed. That's the irony of self-interest. Protecting your own comfort can weaken the systems you will eventually rely on. The baby boomer generation may never fully acknowledge the role it played in shaping this imbalance. But history does not depend on acknowledgement. It depends on outcomes. And the outcome of decades of generational self-interest is clear. Younger generations face heavier burdens. Opportunity is harder to reach. The system that once lifted millions into stability now struggles to lift anyone at all. That is the cost of excess. Not revenge. Not punishment. Just cause and effect. Because when a generation takes more from a system than it replenishes, the bill does not disappear. It moves forward. And eventually, someone has to pay it. Series closing. Over the course of this series, we looked at something most people avoid talking about. Not individuals. Not personalities. A pattern. A generation that entered adulthood during one of the most prosperous periods in American history and shaped the country during the decades that followed. We looked at how opportunity expanded when they were young. How access tightened later. How power consolidated in corporations. How retirement security became layered for those already inside the system. How the math behind those promises is beginning to strain. And finally, who ends up carrying the cost when a system becomes unbalanced. None of this is about blaming every individual person. Generations are made up of millions of different lives and choices. But generations also shape the direction of a country. Through the policies they support. Through the systems they protect. Through the priorities they defend. The purpose of this series wasn't anger. It was clarity. Because understanding how a system changed is the first step to deciding what kind of system comes next. Every generation eventually inherits the responsibility to rebuild what came before it. And the future of the country will depend on whether the generations that follow choose to repeat the same patterns. Or build something more balanced. Their self-interest decisions will come back to them. Because when one generation takes more than a system can replace, the future doesn't argue. It corrects. Every generation eventually answers for the systems it leaves behind. And sooner or later, the bill always reaches the people who thought they'd never have to pay it. The ladder was lifted. The wealth was taken. And the consequences are only beginning. And that brings this series to a close. Over the past several episodes, we've looked at patterns that shaped the country over the last half-century. How opportunity expanded. How access tightened. How power consolidated. How retirement systems stacked security upward. And how the numbers underneath those promises are beginning to strain. This series wasn't about attacking individuals. It was about understanding how a system changed. Because if we don't understand how we got here, we have no chance of deciding where the country goes next. If you found this series thoughtful, challenging, or even uncomfortable, consider supporting the channel. Like the video so more people actually see it. Share it with someone who might see the issue differently. Leave a comment. And subscribe to The Things That Bother Me if you want more deep dives into the things most people prefer not to talk about. Because uncomfortable questions are usually the ones worth asking. And remember, history is patient. And eventually, it balances the books. This is The Things That Bother Me. Until next time.